I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. Every episode, we go beyond the headlines and into the hidden quarters of American violence, the soldiers, the murderers, the martyrs, and the ghosts that history tried to forget. Some of these stories are old, some are still unfolding, but they all ask that same question: what drives ordinary people to cross the line between duty and destruction? This is Deadly Truths. By the time Dutch Schultz was dying on the floor of a Newark tavern bathroom, the most dangerous thing about him was not the bullets. It was what was already happening inside of his head. For years, Dutch ruled through fear, not strategy. Paranoia replaced planning. Suspicion replaced loyalty. He saw betrayal everywhere, and even where none existed. And when the federal government came for him, not with guns, but with numbers, something in him snapped. Dutch didn't just panic, he unraveled. In his final hours, an infection spread and his body failed. His mind did something worse. It fractured. Names spilled out, numbers, half-finished thoughts. A criminal empire reduced to static. This is not the story of a bootlegger who flew too close to the sun. This is the story of a man who lost control of his own mind, and he paid for it. Arthur Fleckenheimer was born in 1902 in the Bronx. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants scraping by at the bottom rung of New York City. This is not romantic immigrant grit. This was crowded tenements, constant instability, and zero margin for weakness. His father had abandoned the family early. That detail matters more than most biographies admit. Dutch didn't grow up with a model of authority. He grew up with absence, resentment, and a mother forced into survival mode. That kind of childhood does not produce patience. It produces vigilance. Early 20th century Bronx was not just poor, it was territorial. Neighborhoods were carved up by ethnicity, religion, street gangs, political machines. Jewish kids, like Dutch, existed in a narrow lane. They were harassed by Irish gangs, they were shut out of legitimate opportunities, and they were pressured to assimilate but never fully accepted, even if they did. Violence was not shocking, it was instructional. So Dutch learned young and early who could be trusted, which was almost no one, when to strike first, and when fear worked better than reason. Dutch absorbed all of this at a very young age. By his teens, Schultz was already involved in petty crime. Not clever crime, but aggressive crime. He was not a planner, he was a reactor. I think that distinction followed him his entire life. Dutch learned early that loud intimidation worked. Brutality stopped a lot of questions, and fear brought silence faster than loyalty ever did. But it also meant constant scanning for threats. Kids who are raised like this, they don't relax. They don't trust systems, and they don't believe rules protect them. They believe rules are weapons used by others to control them. So it was not ideology, it was just survival. And this is key. Dutch Schultz was not about ideology. He wasn't politically motivated ever. He wasn't trying to beat the system. He was trying to never be powerless again. And that's why later he could not tolerate perceived disrespect, and he also fixated on all of his enemies, or even perceived enemies. He was always overreacting to imagined betrayal, and he took threats personally. That's the wiring that is going on here. It's not about prohibition for Dutch Schultz, even though he is part of that history. Early on, Dutch didn't build friendships. He built dominance structures. He didn't charm people into following him like Lucky Luciano did. He scared them into staying around, and that works in street crime. It fails, though, in organizations that require delegation, trust, strategic restraint. Strong on the outside, but all those cracks underneath, the foundation was falling apart. Nothing about Dutch Schultz. Later, Paranoia appears out of nowhere because he grew up in a world where authority had disappeared, a system that was punishing vulnerability. And those streets that he grew up on, they rewarded preemptive violence. His childhood didn't make him evil. It made him hypervigilant, controlling, and emotionally rigid. And it's important to recognize that those are the traits that built his rise. But those same traits guaranteed his collapse. By the time Prohibition arrived, Dutch Schultz wasn't becoming someone new. He was finally stepping into an environment that rewarded exactly what he already was. And that's when the real damage began. Prohibition didn't turn Dutch Schultz into a criminal mastermind. It removed the last restraints that kept his worst instincts in check. For men with patience, diplomacy, and long vision, Prohibition was an opportunity, like I covered for Lucky Luciano in the episode right before this one. But for somebody like Dutch, it was a permission slip. Early on, Dutch thrived because Prohibition created complete and utter chaos. Territory changed overnight. Rules, they were unclear. And law enforcement was fragmented and it was corruptible. And Dutch excelled in this arena. I mean, he was great at rapid intimidation, really good at sudden unexplained violence, and he was absolutely fabulous at crushing competitors before alliances could form. And this played directly into his existing wiring because, as I had mentioned, he was all about striking first, escalating fast, and never negotiating longer than necessary. But that phase did not last. Prohibition matured. Successful bootleggers, they adapted. They built layered organizations. They used mediators, paid for insulation. They let others take risks for them. But Dutch refused to do that. He micromanaged. He involved himself personally, and he could not tolerate ambiguity. He looked like a hands-on leader, but he was actually dealing with control pathology. Bootlegging requires trust. You've got to have drivers, warehouse managers, accountants, political fixers. Dutch did not trust any of these people. He suspected informants were everywhere. He reran loyalty tests. He punished perceived slights. And he also interrogated his own men. Instead of stabilizing his empire, he stabilized it. Fear does not scale, it fractures. And now it's time for the pivot point that a lot of people don't really get to when they're discussing Dutch Schultz. His early violence did remove obstacles, but the later violence, it just attracted unwanted attention. Dutch didn't make that distinction. He responded emotionally instead. So he responded to rumors, to insults, to imagined betrayal. His hits were not about efficiency. They were about regaining internal control. And of course, that's not leadership, that's anxiety acting out. Early in his career, Dutch used violence instrumentally. He removed rivals, he secured territory, he would send a message just once. But by the early 1930s, that had all changed. The violence became reactive, emotional, and destabilizing. A good example of this is the murder murder of Joe Weinberg. Bo was not a rival. He was Dutch Schultz's right-hand man, his most trusted lieutenant. Weinberg handled money, logistics, and enforcement. If anyone knew the operation, it was him. Dutch became convinced, with no solid evidence, that Bo was skimming or talking. There was no tribunal, no commission approval, no strategic upside. Dutch personally ordered Bo lured to a safe location and had him executed. And killing a senior lieutenant, that destabilizes any organization, right? It terrifies remaining crew members. It increases the odds of informants, not loyalty. This was not a calculated move. It was paranoia acting through violence. After Bo's death, Dutch's inner circle, it fractured. Men didn't feel protected. They felt expendable. And of course, that's not power, that's collapse. As pressure mounted, he began to repeatedly interrogate his own men. He was accusing associates of betrayal without any evidence. He was issuing threats over minor issues or just rumors. And this just became part of the emotional volatility that surrounded him. Men could not predict his reactions. Predictability is the foundation for organized crime, but Dutch destroyed it himself. When Dutch targeted Legs Diamond, the violence, it did have purpose. And if you're wondering who Legs Diamond is, that was somebody early on in Dutch's bootlegging career that was a huge rival. He controlled overlapping territory. That hit was about removing the competition. Even though Diamond survived multiple attempts before later being killed, which is horrendous, the intent was technically strategic. But by the 1930s, all that logic was gone, and that's where the violence becomes delusional. Dutch openly discussed assassinating U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey, and this was not whispered paranoia. He talked about it in front of people. Of course, if he actually wanted to act on that, it would have brought federal annihilation. It offered no realistic payoff, and it endangered every syndicate leader connected to him. So it was complete bravado, and it was a loss of judgment on his part. The commission, which was being ran by Lucky Luciano, did not see a tough guy. They saw a man who no longer understood his boundaries. The mob tolerates brutality, but it does not tolerate instability. Dutch's violence increased exposure and it created informants, and it was also threatening the entire syndicate. And that's why he was marked, not because he was cruel, not because he was greedy, but because his violence stopped serving a purpose. Dutch made a lot of money during Prohibition, but he refused the buffers others used. He didn't pay for those. He held too much personally, and he talked way too openly, and he kept no emotional distance with people. He inserted himself into disputes that didn't even require him. As profits grew, so did the scrutiny. And as scrutiny grew, so did his paranoia. Basically, huge feedback loop, and there was no off-ramp. This is where Prohibition fully breaks him. Dutch understands street power. He understands corrupt cops, but he did not understand bureaucracy, right? You can't threaten spreadsheets. You can't scare auditors. You can't intimidate federal tax law. The IRS represented everything he feared. It was impersonal authority, relentless procedure, no visible enemy to strike. This wasn't a legal threat. It was a psychological one for him. Dutch wasn't undone by bad luck, though. He was undone by traits Prohibition briefly rewarded and then punished him for. And that's important to understand because, yes, in the beginning, he was impulsive and that worked out. He had control obsession. That worked out too. Paranoia, emotional violence, sure. But later on, That was definitely not playing to his hand. Those traits, they built him fast and they destroyed him faster. By the early 1930s, Dutch Schultz was not fighting rivals anymore. He was fighting his loss of control. And when men like that feel cornered, they don't retreat, they explode. No doctor ever formally diagnosed Dutch Schultz in life, but based on documented behavior, other accounts, his final medical condition, historians and clinicians do reasonably narrow that field down. This was not just a bad temper. Dutch did show lifelong traits consistent with paranoid personality features like suspicion, hypervigilance, hostility, controlled obsession. But in the 1930s, those traits appear to worsen. They do not remain static. They get considerably worse. And that does suggest decompensation when a personality structure collapses under stress. And that would explain killing trusted lieutenants, obsessive loyalty tests, and inability to adapt to the strategic threats like the IRS or dealing with the courts. And then you also have the fact that of the emotional violence, which was replacing the instrumental violence that he should have been using if you wanted to be an actual legit and good bootlegger, right? So paranoia stopped being a trait that became a driver. We're dealing with and talking about someone who had chronic stress and added to that hyperarousal and sleep deprivation. Dutch lived in constant threat. I mean, if you look at his competitors and what happened to them, he has this endless fear of assassination. He was right about that one, right? And of course, you've got federal prosecution hanging over the head, too. Well, men like him, they did not sleep normally. They did not downshift. Long-term hyperarousal, that can cause impaired judgment, emotional volatility, black and white thinking, and fixation. They do not have the kind of impulse control a lot of people who are not in hyperarousal have. They've got reduced impulse control. This doesn't excuse his behavior, but it definitely explains how his breakdown accelerated like it did. Could also throw in there the possible neurological or infectious contribution to this scenario. Of course, it's unproven, but it is plausible. And it's a bit sticky, and it's rarely discussed. But Dutch died from infection and complications, not the instant gunshot trauma. So his final hours did include him rambling. He had disorganized thoughts. He was naming unrelated people and numbers, complete incoherence. That delirium is explained by infection, but it raises a bigger question. Was something already happening neurologically before the shooting? Possibility, right? And historians have raised this question. Did he have untreated syphilis? It's not uncommon for that era. Al Capone had that going on. Then there's alcohol-related cognitive impairment. Again, very common for back then, still common today. We've got head trauma from earlier violence, probably a good chance of that as well. So there is no definitive evidence, but it does stay in the realm of possibility. It's not a diagnosis, but there's a good chance one or some of those might have been going on as well. But his late-stage cognitive disorganization was definitely real, and it was definitely documented. I think it's important to say Dutch Schultz was not a psychopath. He's easily labeled like that by a lot of people who do episodes on him or discuss him because I suppose when you look at him just from the outside without digging into the research on who he was and what happened, it's very easy to label somebody like him as a psychopath. That was not the case. And the reason we can say Dutch Schultz was definitely not a psychopath is because psychopathy is stable. Dutch became less stable. That alone tells us something changed. We can't name a single disorder when it comes to who and what Dutch Schultz was, but we can say that Dutch Schultz showed signs of progressive psychological and possibly neurological deterioration driven by paranoia, chronic stress, and loss of control. And it reached a point where even other killers considered him unsafe. Boy, is that a huge red flag. Didn't just lose power, he lost coherence. Exile was on the table, it was discussed, but it was rejected for very specific reasons. The commission didn't execute men for being violent, they executed men who they could not manage. And around 1934 to 1935, Dutch had done more than one thing that had upset the commission and also gotten their attention. One, he ignored the commission's authority. He acted without permission. He made unilateral decisions, and he refused to back down when ordered to do so. Most importantly, he argued as well with them. When told not to pursue certain actions, he did not comply. He pushed. Dutch had also developed a reputation for speaking openly in front of subordinates and talking about strategy where he should not. He was always venting his paranoia, and he was naming names when he got really agitated. A man under federal indictment who cannot control his speech is radioactive. Exile requires silence, but Dutch could not provide that, and the commission knew it. Then, when Dutch's talk of assassinating a U.S. attorney, which was Thomas Dewey, the commission knew that this was not hypothetical. Dutch was serious. He brought it up repeatedly. He pushed for approval and he would not let it go. And it terrified the commission. Killing a federal prosecutor would trigger total federal retaliation. It would be the collapse of the political protection that the commission did have, and it would bring the army, not just the cops. The commission said no, but Dutch did not hear it. At that point, exile became meaningless because the risk followed him. By the time the vote was taken, the question wasn't if he would cause catastrophe. It was when. Dutch Schultz did not die because he broke the rules. The execution authority did come through Lucky Luciano with Lapke, Butch Alter carrying it out operationally. That's the cleanest and most historical supported answer when you do the research on this. And what we do know is that by mid 1935, Dutch Schultz had become a shared liability. Multiple families were exposed by his tax case, his obsession with killing Thomas Dewey, and his refusal to back down after being told no. The commission, which was the governing body of organized crime, had discussed the problem, and they did not vote often, but they did vote on this, and the consensus was Schultz had to be removed, not disciplined, not sidelined, removed. Lucky Luciano was not just another boss, he was the architect of the commission itself, and he pushed hardest against Schultz-Dewey's obsession. He understood federal retaliation risk, and he prioritized long-term stability over territorial loyalty. Luciano did not pull the trigger. He didn't need to. His role was the authorization. In mob terms, that is the order. Here's the key detail, again, most people will miss. The hit was carried out by Murder Inc., the enforcement arm tied to Lapke. Why Lapke? Because he was trusted by the commission. He had no loyalty to Schultz, and his crews were efficient and expendable, and he could plausibly deny direct involvement. Outsourcing the hit was intentional. It insulated the Italian families from blame. And that matters. They didn't trust Dutch's inner circle to carry out the hit cleanly. It was too emotional, too compromised, and too unstable. Using outside hitters ensured no hesitation, no loyalty conflict, and no second guessing. And that tells you how far Schultz had fallen. And all of this comes from later on converging testimony, post hit silence from the leadership, immediate redistribution of Schultz territory, and no retaliation. Those are all the tells. The plan was simple, though. Too simple. And that was the problem. Dutch Schultz wasn't hiding. That alone tells you how far gone he was. He was drinking at the Palace Chop House in Newark, a public place. It was predictable and familiar. He believed proximity to people meant safety. It did not. Inside with him was Otto Berman. That was his numbers man. There was a guy named Abe Landau. That was his chief enforcer. And then there was Bernie Lulu Rosenkratz, which was an associate. This was not a hardened security detail. This was routine. Routine gets you killed. So the hitters were Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mindy Weiss, or you want to do the German pronunciation of that? Weiss, acting under Lapke Butch Alter's enforcement ring. They were professionals, but professionals still rely on timing, and timing failed them. The plan was to walk in, shoot Schultz quickly, kill Berman, get out clean. A fast execution, no mess, no survivors. That's not what happened. As the shooters entered the restroom area, Abe Landau reacted faster than expected. Landau drew a weapon and fired. That split second changed everything. Instead of a controlled execution, shots went wide, targets moved, panic erupted, and bullets hit walls, bodies, and bystanders. Schultz was hit, but not fatally. Berman was mortally wounded. Landau was badly injured, but survived. The shooters fled into the night, leaving unfinished business behind. So when you ask the question, well, why did that hit go wrong? They underestimated Landau and they expected fear. They got resistance. Landau wasn't loyal. He was conditioned. He reacted on instinct. That single act turned a clean hit into complete chaos. Schultz absorbed gunshot wounds that should have killed him quickly, but they did not. He lingered. That was dangerous. It was sloppy by necessity. He chose speed over certainty. And this is the critical failure. Dutch Schultz survived long enough to be taken to the hospital, to be questioned, to speak and ramble, name names, and expose fragments of the underworld. The commission wanted silence. They got delirium. Once Schultz was alive, the priority shifted. It was not justice, not mercy. It was containment. Doctors were monitored. Police presence was managed. Information was minimized. Still, the damage was done. Man killed for talking too much spent his last hours talking uncontrollably, not because he chose to, because his brain could no longer regulate itself. Dutch Schultz wasn't supposed to die in a hospital bed. He was supposed to disappear. Instead, he became a liability one last time, alive, exposed, and unraveling. Dutch Schultz didn't die screaming defiance or issuing confessions. He had severe internal bleeding, and he was rapidly developing an infection. Add to that, of course, shock. The combination causes toxic delirium. Delirium is not rambling talk, it is global brain failure. The brain loses filtering, sequencing, inhibition, reality anchoring, and that's what happened next. Dutch speech in the hospital followed a pattern clinicians would recognize immediately. He spoke names, some real, some partial, and some unclear. They weren't confessions, not lists, and not fragments. This is a memory leakage. It's not disclosure. A healthy brain suppresses irrelevant associations, but he could not. And then there were the numbers and the addresses and the half thoughts. He muttered numbers, locations, disconnected phrases, and it was in repeated loops. And this is classic disorganized condition, often seen in severe infection, stage shock, meaning collapse. Only raw data remained. There's no narrative in what he was saying. There's no strategy there. And that is critical because Dutch did not confess to crimes, lay out operations, name the commission, expose hierarchy. If he were talking, he would have told a story, but he did not because storytelling requires a frontal lobe to control it, and that was gone. The man killed for instability, became unstable in the most literal neurological sense. And this is the key point. Delirium reveals what regulation was already failing him. Dutch's late stage behavior before death, with the compulsive talking and the obsessive fixation and the loss of judgment, the hospital delirium wasn't just a sudden change, it was the final collapse of a system that had already been degrading. And honestly, don't you just find it all very sad? So let's be precise. This was not a deathbed confession. This was not remorse. This was not cooperation. This was not strategy. It was just noise, a brain overheating and shutting down. And why does that matter historically? Because it explains why the commission acted the way that it did back then. It also explains why exile was impossible, why they needed finality, and why Dutch frightened even other killers. He wasn't just dangerous, he was uncontainable. And that's what should be remembered about Dutch Schultz. It was not that he was a psychopath. He was just flat out uncontainable. Dutch Schultz is often remembered as a gangster who went too far, and that's not quite right. He was a man who mistook control for strength and never learned the difference. From childhood, Dutch learned that safety didn't come from trust or structure. It came from dominance, from fear, and from striking first. Those traits worked until they didn't. Violence gave him power early, but power without regulation always turns inward. As pressure mounted, Dutch didn't adapt. He tightened his grip on his men, on information, on imagined threats. The tighter he held on, the less control he actually had. That's the paradox at the center of his life. And if you're wondering why I'm getting into all the psychology around who he was, because it matters. Because violence isn't just an act. It's a coping strategy. For Dutch Schultz, violence wasn't about efficiency or profit. It was about soothing anxiety. And when anxiety runs the system, violence stops being strategic. It becomes compulsive, predictable, and fatal. The mob did not kill Dutch Schultz because he was cruel. They killed him because he was dysregulated. Dutch didn't lose control in the hospital. He lost it years earlier. The bullets just made it undeniable. Another point to make, I had mentioned this earlier, was how quickly Dutch Schultz's territory was divided, and I had said it was a tell. So Schultz rackets, they were divided up right after his death. His territory was absorbed by Italian families. There was no retaliation that followed, and there was no loyalty uprising that occurred. And that silence is the verdict on his leadership. It proves his control was fear-based and it was not structural. There was no revenge because the order was sanctioned. His men were probably relieved and the risk died with him. Stability was restored instantly. That's rare and it's damning. Let's just take a second and do a myth versus reality check. Dutch was a genius strategist. No, he was not. He was betrayed. Nope, he was voted out. He talked to the police. No. He was dying. He was delirious. He was in shock. Dutch Schultz didn't lose power when the mob turned on him. He lost it the moment fear replaced strategy. As Dutch Schultz's paranoia escalated, he increasingly used public violence and intimidation. That led to bystanders being wounded during shootings, civilians threatened or assaulted during extortions, businesses targeted not because they resisted, but because they existed in his territory. These people weren't rivals, they weren't criminals, they were useful objects in his control strategy. Let's face it, that's a moral line crossed. Due to Dutch's orders, his rackets increasingly targeted small restaurant owners, market vendors, local operators with no organized crime ties at all. And then protection. These poor individuals would pay protection money, but get no protection. Failure to pay led to beatings, property damage, threats to their family. These weren't gangland negotiations, they were predatory acts against civilians. And then looking back on the Joe Weinberg, I mean, no, the guy wasn't innocent, but he definitely didn't deserve death. And that distinction matters. Bo was a criminal, but he was not a traitor. There was no evidence that he was informing or skimming. His execution was based on unfounded suspicion. In mob terms, that makes him a wrongful internal killing, a victim of paranoia, not justice. And this is where Dutch's violence stops being part of the life and becomes pathological. As Dutch unraveled, lower tier men were punished for rumors and they were threatened for imagined disloyalty. They were killed and assaulted without proof. These men weren't decision makers, they weren't power brokers, they were expendable bodies used to relieve Dutch's anxiety. And that's pretty damn awful. And of course, you've got that quiet damage that often gets skipped. Dutch's instability meant there was widows with no recourse, children left without providers, neighborhoods ruled by unpredictable violence. This is why his death did not spark mourning or even sorrow among fellow criminals. Dutch Schultz didn't just victimize rivals, he victimized anyone unlucky enough to fall inside his shrinking circle of fear. Unlike Luciano or Lansky, Schultz is not remembered as a system builder. Historians consistently describe him as brutal, paranoid, erratic, short-sighted. He built power fast, he lost it faster. That matters in organized crime history, which values longevity and structure over spectacle. Prohibition ends, power consolidates, crime professionalizes. Dutch didn't. History places him in the category of men who thrived in chaos but failed in order. And that's not myth, that's assessment. If you asked historians what ended Dutch Schultz, they won't say bullets, they'll say the IRS. He's remembered as one of the last major gangsters undone by tax law. He's a symbol of how federal bureaucracy replaced straight justice. Fair or not, his final hours dominate how he is remembered. It's not bravery, it's not defiance. His hospital ramblings are cited in history books and psychology discussions and criminal pathology analysis. He's remembered as a man whose mind collapsed publicly, not heroic. And honestly, it's unsettling. And here's the cold truth. Dutch Schultz, well, he's remembered less for what he built than for what his death allowed, which was smoother syndicate control, reduced chaos, clearer hierarchy. In that sense, history remembers him as an obstacle that was removed. Pop culture sometimes paints him as a wild bootlegger, a fearless outlaw, and a colorful madman. But academic history doesn't. It remembers him as a destabilizing force, a failure of self-regulation, and a transitional figure whose removal signaled the end of raw Prohibition-era brutality. Dutch Schultz isn't remembered as great. He's remembered as dangerous in the wrong way. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If the story stayed with you, follow, rate, and share the show. It's how these histories don't disappear again. Research and narration, it's always done by me. I'm sure you can tell. Sources for this episode included contemporary newspaper reporting, court records, FBI files, and historical scholarship on Prohibition era organized crime. And remember, the past is not dead, it's just being forged in the murder factory.